By the early 1940s, the Crosley Corporation employed 10,000 workers in a single Cincinnati factory, the largest employer in the city. They built the radios that made broadcasting affordable, the refrigerators that put shelves in the door for the first time, and a signal from WLW strong enough to reach half the continent from the upper floors of the same building where the products were assembled. Then, in 1945, the founder sold. An aviation conglomerate called Avco paid $22 million for a consumer empire it didn't understand. A decade of slow erosion, television battles it couldn't win, patents that expired, a founder's instinct replaced by portfolio logic. By 1956, the entire Crosley household line was discontinued. By 1960, the factory was closed. The building still stands in Camp Washington. Condemned. 330,000 square feet of silence where the work used to be. This is the story of how Powell Crosley Jr. turned a child's request for a radio into an industrial empire that changed how America listened and how it kept its food cold, and how a single sale in peacetime undid what the Depression and the war could not. Not through catastrophe. Through the quiet arithmetic of men who managed what they'd never built. There's a building in Camp Washington, Cincinnati, that still looks like it's waiting for someone to come back. It's enormous. Over 300,000 square feet of concrete and brick, white tower rising above the freight tracks, windows punched out or boarded over. The kind of place you could drive past 1,000 times and never wonder about unless someone told you what used to happen inside. What used to happen inside was everything. Radios, refrigerators, ranges, washing machines, and upstairs on the top floors, a broadcasting operation so powerful it could reach half the continent from a single transmitter. The name on the building was Crosley, and for a generation it meant something closer to the future than the past. The man who put that name there was Powell Crosley Jr., born in 1886 to a prosperous Cincinnati lawyer's family. The kind of comfortable household where ambition was expected and failure was tolerated, at least for a while. Powell had ambition in quantities that alarmed the people around him. He also had a gift for failure that, in his early years, rivaled the ambition almost exactly. He flunked out of the University of Cincinnati, not once, 3 times. Each exit was less dramatic than the last because by the third attempt, nobody expected much from the classroom anyway. What Powell wanted was machines, specifically cars, the new convulsive industry shaking itself into shape across the Midwest. As a teenager, he'd built a crude automobile in his father's carriage house, a thing of wood and belt drives and adolescent overconfidence, and won a bet from his father in the process. That car didn't last. The obsession did. Behind Powell stood his younger brother, Lewis M. Crosley, and Lewis was the opposite of nearly everything Powell advertised to the world. Where Powell chased the next big idea, Lewis tracked the details. Where Powell moved on instinct, Lewis moved on numbers. Rusty McClure, a family chronicler who spent years collecting Crosley lore, put it simply, Powell kept trying things, and Lewis made them work. That partnership, the dreamer and the operator, the man who saw around corners and the man who built the road to get there, is where the Crosley story actually begins. Not with a radio, not with a factory, with 2 brothers who needed each other and knew it. Powell tried to break into the automobile business directly. He failed. He tried again, failed again. The family's comfortable money cushioned the falls, but it couldn't manufacture success. What it could do was buy him time, and time was what Powell needed. Not to learn patience, because he never learned that, but to find the gap between what he wanted and what the market would actually reward. He found it in auto accessories. In 1916, Powell Crosley Jr. co-founded the American Automobile Accessory Company with a partner named Ira J. Cooper. The idea was small, or seemed small. Instead of building entire cars, which required capital and manufacturing infrastructure Powell didn't have, they would sell the things that went on and around cars. Tire repair kits, gadgets, replacement parts, the kind of aftermarket business that fed off other people's products. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what Powell dreamed about when he imagined himself as the next Henry Ford. But it worked. Lewis ran the machinery of the business, the books, the logistics, the warehouse floor, while Powell ran the front. He was a natural salesman, persuasive in the way of men who genuinely believe every product they touch is about to change the world. The tire liner they sold wasn't just a tire liner. It was a solution, an advance, a small revolution in rubber. The revenue grew fast. By 1919, the brothers had moved more than $1 million worth of auto parts and accessories. $1 million in 1919 was serious money. Not Ford money, not Rockefeller money, but enough to prove that these two could build something together that neither could build alone. Powell had found his workaround. He couldn't build cars. He could build everything around them. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story, but the car dream wouldn't let go. It lingered in Powell like a low-grade fever, flaring up at odd moments, subsiding but never breaking. He'd come back to it later, in a form that nobody expected. For now, though, the accessories business taught him two things that would define the rest of his career. First, that ordinary people would pay for products that made their lives slightly more convenient, as long as the price was right. Second, that price, not quality, not prestige, not brand mystique, was the lever that moved the American consumer market. Make it cheap enough, and they'd buy it. Make it cheap enough and good enough, and they'd buy it forever. That philosophy was about to find its perfect subject, because in 1921, Powell Crosley's 9-year-old son asked for a radio. The boy had seen one somewhere, the details vary depending on who tells the story, and wanted one for the house. Powell went shopping. The cheapest set he could find cost more than he thought any reasonable person should pay for a box that pulled voices out of the air. The exact figure depends on the source, but the reaction was consistent. Powell looked at the price, looked at the radio, and decided he could build one cheaper. He was right. Within months, the Crosley Manufacturing Corporation was producing simple, affordable radio receivers. The first models were bare bones, a crystal set, minimal cabinetry, the kind of product that a serious radio engineer might have dismissed as a toy. But Powell wasn't selling to engineers. He was selling to families. Families who'd heard about this new thing called broadcasting and couldn't afford the big Westinghouse or RCA sets that dominated the early market. What Crosley offered was access. Not the best radio, but the first radio a working household could justify buying. And the price kept dropping. Crosley pushed his manufacturing toward volume and simplicity, stripping out everything that didn't directly contribute to the signal reaching the speaker. His competitors were building furniture, elaborate wooden cabinets with decorative veneer, marketed as living room centerpieces. Crosley was building function. The difference showed up on the price tag. By the early 1920s, Crosley was advertising radio sets starting at prices low enough that the product began to feel almost disposable, a household tool, not a luxury. The Automotive Hall of Fame credits him with offering a set at $20 when competitors charged many times that. Some accounts place early models like the Harco even lower, near $7. The exact sequence matters less than the principle. Crosley found the price floor, and then he kept digging. That instinct, the conviction that the American consumer market was far bigger than anyone imagined, if only you priced low enough to reach the bottom, was what turned a failed car man and a successful parts dealer into something much larger. Powell Crosley Jr. was about to become the largest radio manufacturer in the world. His son's birthday request had opened a door into an industry that barely existed. Powell walked through it like a man who'd been looking for that door his whole life. By 1924, Crosley radios were everywhere. Not everywhere in the way that prestige brands are everywhere. Visible in advertisements and department stores and the homes of people who could afford to be early adopters. Everywhere in the way that a basic tool is everywhere. On kitchen counters, on nightstands, in parlors that had never held anything electronic before. Crosley had cracked the volume problem. He'd figured out that if you made a radio simple enough to mass produce and cheap enough to impulse buy, the American public would absorb them in quantities that made profit margins almost irrelevant on a per-unit basis and enormously relevant at scale. The numbers backed him up. Within a few years of entering the radio business, Crosley was the largest manufacturer of radio receivers in the world. Not in Cincinnati, not in Ohio. In the world. The Henry Ford of radio. That's what the press called him. And for once, the comparison wasn't lazy. Like Ford, Crosley understood that democratizing a technology meant attacking its price, not refining its features. The family that couldn't afford an RCA radiola could afford a Crosley, and there were millions of those families. But Powell understood something Ford never had to worry about. A radio without something to listen to was just a wooden box with wires. An automobile carried you somewhere useful no matter who built the roads. A radio needed a signal. So in 1922, the Crosleys launched WLW, a broadcasting station that started small, at modest wattage, and then grew with the ambition of the men who built it. WLW didn't just grow, it roared. By the early 1930s, the station was operating at 500,000 watts, a figure so large that the Federal Communications Commission eventually forced a reduction. At that power, WLW could be heard across most of the eastern United States and into Canada. People called it the nation's station, and the name wasn't marketing. It was geography. A farmer in Tennessee could pick up WLW on a Crosley receiver and hear the same programs as a family in suburban Cleveland. The signal didn't care about distance. It didn't care about class. It traveled, and wherever it landed, it sold more radios. This was the move that separated Crosley from every other manufacturer in the business. He wasn't just selling hardware. He was building an ecosystem. The radios made the station viable because more listeners meant more advertising revenue. The station made the radios irresistible because WLW gave people a reason to buy one. Each half of the business fed the other, and the whole thing accelerated together, a flywheel spinning faster every quarter. Powell understood this intuitively. Lewis made it operational. While Powell evangelized on the product side, always another model, always another price point, always another reason the Crosley radio was the radio for the American family. Lewis managed the expanding infrastructure. More employees, more factory space, more logistical complexity behind every unit that rolled off the line. The brothers still needed each other, and the need was growing with the company. Then Powell made one of the most consequential decisions of his career, and he made it with cash. In 1929, with the stock market climbing toward a peak that almost nobody believed was a peak, the Crosley Corporation commissioned the architectural firm of Samuel Hannaford and Sons to design a new manufacturing building on Arlington Street in Camp Washington. The building would be enormous, roughly 330,000 square feet, big enough to consolidate radio production, broadcasting operations, and future product lines under one roof. And Crosley paid for it outright. No bonds, no leveraged financing, no borrowing against future earnings. Cash on the barrel. The crash came months later. The stock market collapsed. The economy followed. Companies that had built on credit found their foundations dissolving. Banks called in loans that couldn't be repaid. Factories that had financed expansion with bonds went dark. Crosley, sitting in a brand new building that was entirely paid for, kept running. That timing was not genius. It was luck married to conservatism. Lewis's conservatism, most likely, the careful brothers' insistence that you didn't build what you couldn't afford. But luck or not, the result was decisive. While competitors contracted, Crosley expanded. While other radio manufacturers scrambled to survive the Depression, the Crosleys pushed further into consumer markets because they had a plant, they had capacity, and they had no debt service eating them alive. The Arlington Street building became the physical center of everything. Radio production on some floors, WLW's studios on the upper floors, broadcast engineers and assembly line workers sharing the same stairwells, the same cafeteria, the same parking lot. It was a factory that talked. A manufacturing plant with a signal tower. Nothing else in American industry looked quite like it, because nobody else had fused making and broadcasting into a single building and a single business logic. And the Crosleys weren't done. The radios had proved that Powell's instinct about price and access could reshape a market. Now the brothers looked at the American kitchen and saw the same opportunity. A room full of expensive, under-evolved appliances that most families couldn't afford, made by companies that had no interest in making them cheaper. The Crosley Corporation was about to do to refrigerators what it had done to radios. The factory on Arlington Street was going to need every square foot. If you'd walked into the Crosley plant on Arlington Street in the mid-1930s, the first thing you would have noticed was the noise. Not one noise, but layers. A working building's acoustic fingerprint. Down on the production floors, the stamp and clatter of parts being pressed and assembled, the whine of conveyor motors, the clank of metal housings being fitted together, compressed air hissing through pneumatic tools, soldering irons, test sets crackling as finished radios were powered up and tuned before packing. The smell of solder flux hung in the air, sharp and slightly sweet, mixing with machine oil and the particular warm dust scent of electrical components under load. But then, and this was the strange part, the part that made Crosley's plant different from every other factory in Cincinnati, you'd take the stairs or the freight elevator up, past the assembly floors, and the noise would change. The industrial clatter would fade, replaced by something quieter and stranger. The hum of broadcast equipment, the murmur of voices behind soundproofed glass, the faint bleat of music from a rehearsal studio. WLW lived on the upper floors of the same building. The workers who bolted radio chassis together on the third floor shared the structure with the announcers and engineers who sent programming into those radios from 2 stories above. People in Camp Washington could walk to work at the Crosley plant. The neighborhood was dense and industrial, a cluster of modest houses, shops, rail sidings, and small factories wedged between the Mill Creek Valley and the hillsides. Arlington Street was close enough that a morning shift worker could leave his front door, walk 10 or 15 minutes through streets that smelled of coal smoke and damp limestone, and punch in at a building where America's most powerful radio station operated directly above his workstation. The proximity was not accidental. The Crosleys had planted their factory in a neighborhood where labor lived within earshot of the shift whistle. Inside, the plant ran on the rhythm that all big manufacturing operations ran on. The shift changes, the lunch breaks, the Friday paychecks that kept Camp Washington's grocers and barbers and landlords solvent. But the Crosley plant also ran on something else, a constant stream of new products. Powell couldn't stop inventing. Lewis couldn't stop refining. Between them, they pushed an extraordinary range of goods through that building. Radios in every configuration, tabletop sets, console models, battery-powered portables for rural customers who didn't have electricity yet, then small appliances, then large ones. The shift from radios to kitchen appliances was not a pivot. It was an extension of the same logic. If the American family needed affordable access to radio, it also needed affordable access to refrigeration. In the early 1930s, mechanical refrigerators were still luxury items for much of the country. Expensive, unreliable, marketed as status objects rather than household necessities. Crosley looked at the refrigerator market the way Powell had looked at the radio market a decade earlier. Too expensive, too exclusive, ripe for disruption from below. The result was the Shelvador, and the Shelvador was a masterpiece of practical design. The concept was so simple it sounds almost silly to describe. Crosley put shelves in the refrigerator door. That was it. Shelves in the door. Before the Shelvador, refrigerator doors were flat panels. They opened and closed and did nothing else. All the storage was inside the main compartment, which meant reaching past tall bottles to find the butter, stacking items in unstable towers, wasting space that the door's swing volume could have used. Crosley's engineers, Lewis's engineers really, because Lewis drove the mechanical development, designed a door with molded shelves that held bottles, jars, eggs, and small containers, instantly increasing usable storage without increasing the refrigerator's footprint. It sounds obvious now, because every refrigerator in America has door shelves today. That's the point. The Shelvador was so successful, so immediately and universally logical, that it stopped being a Crosley innovation and became a refrigerator standard. Competitors fought the patent as long as they could and then adopted the concept the moment legal protection weakened. Crosley had invented something so good that the industry absorbed it and forgot where it came from. The Shelvador rolled off the same Arlington Street production lines as the radios. Workers on the refrigerator floors handled heavier materials, stamped steel panels, compressor units, insulation, and the air smelled different, more metallic and cold. The lubricants used on refrigeration compressors carrying a different chemical sharpness than the solder flux on the radio floors. But the paychecks came from the same place, and the cafeteria served the same coffee, and the shift whistle governed the same day. One building, many products, a single industrial identity held together by two brothers, and a conviction that ordinary Americans deserved better things at lower prices. By the mid-1930s, the Crosley name had settled into Cincinnati, the way a river settles into its valley. Present, assumed, part of the landscape's working logic. You heard Crosley on the radio because WLW was the dominant station for hundreds of miles. You kept your milk cold in a Crosley Shelvador. You might cook on a Crosley range. If you were a baseball fan, you followed the Reds at Crosley Field because Powell had bought the team in 1934 and renamed their ballpark after himself, not out of pure vanity, though vanity was never far from Powell's decisions, but because the name on the stadium was the name on the radio was the name on the refrigerator, and all of it fed the same engine. WLW carried the Reds games to listeners across the Ohio Valley and beyond. A family in rural Kentucky who couldn't afford a trip to Cincinnati could sit on a porch with a Crosley radio and hear Red Barber call the play-by-play, and the experience, the voices, the crowd noise, the crack of the bat rendered in vacuum tubes and speaker cones was as real to them as anything happening in their own town. Crosley hadn't just sold them a radio, he'd sold them a connection to a larger world, and the station and the team and the products and the factory were all part of the same offer. Buy in at any point, and you were inside the Crosley ecosystem. The ballpark itself made history. In 1935, Crosley Field hosted the first night game in Major League Baseball. Powell had pushed for the installation of lights, convinced that working families, his customers, his listeners, his market, couldn't attend day games because they were at work. The innovation was pure Crosley. Practical, populist, aimed at the people who couldn't afford to take an afternoon off. President Franklin Roosevelt pressed a ceremonial button in the White House to switch on the lights. The Reds beat the Phillies. 20,000 people watched baseball after dark for the first time in Major League history, and the man who made it happen was the same man who'd put shelves in the refrigerator door. That range, radios, refrigerators, ranges, a baseball team, a broadcasting station powerful enough to blanket half the country, was what made Crosley unusual even among the big industrial names of the era. General Electric was larger. RCA was more prestigious. But neither of them had built what Crosley had built, a vertically integrated consumer world anchored in a single city, manufactured in a single neighborhood, and broadcast from the same building where the products were assembled. Crosley wasn't a company. It was an atmosphere. Meanwhile, the labor force in Camp Washington and the surrounding neighborhoods was changing with the country. The Depression had reshuffled populations. Migration from Appalachia and the Upper South was feeding Cincinnati's industrial base with new workers, families who'd come north looking for wages that couldn't be found in the hollows of eastern Kentucky or the played-out farm country of southern Ohio. By the time the world tipped toward war in the late 1930s, the Crosley plant was drawing from a labor pool that was broader, more diverse, and more dependent on the factory than it had been a decade earlier. The plant wasn't just Camp Washington's largest employer. For many families, it was Camp Washington's reason for being. Then the war came, and everything changed. Scale, secrecy, purpose. The Crosley Corporation had spent 2 decades making things that entertained and fed American families. Now it was going to make things that helped win a war, and the Arlington Street building was about to become a place that most of its own workers couldn't fully know. During World War II, the Crosley plant became something it had never been before, a secret. Sections of the Arlington Street building were placed under military guard. Workers who'd spent years walking freely between floors found certain stairwells blocked, certain corridors newly walled off, certain rooms accessible only to people with clearances that most of the plant's employees didn't have and wouldn't receive. What was happening behind those guarded doors was war production on a scale that dwarfed anything the plant had done in peacetime. Crosley manufactured proximity fuses, the miniaturized radio-triggered detonators that allowed anti-aircraft shells to explode near their targets without requiring a direct hit. The technology was among the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and Crosley's expertise in radio miniaturization made the Arlington Street plant a natural production site. Workers on the proximity fuse lines were often women, many of them drawn from the same Appalachian and southern Ohio communities that had been feeding the plant's labor pool for years. Some accounts describe the fuse workforce as heavily female and substantially of German descent, a detail that quietly underscores how deeply embedded the Crosley plant was in Cincinnati's ethnic and migratory fabric. The scale of wartime employment was staggering. At its peak, the Crosley Corporation was described as Cincinnati's largest single employer, with approximately 10,000 workers passing through its gates. 10,000, a small city's worth of labor organized around a single industrial purpose, housed in a neighborhood of modest homes and corner stores. The paychecks kept Camp Washington alive. The production kept the military supplied. The building that had once made cheap radios and clever refrigerators was now part of the arsenal of democracy, and the transformation had happened almost overnight. Powell Crosley Jr. was in his late 50s by then. The restless tinkerer who'd failed out of college 3 times and built a car in his father's carriage house was now presiding over one of the most important war production operations in the Midwest. Lewis handled the operational complexity. 10,000 workers, military specifications, security protocols, production quotas, with the same quiet precision he'd brought to every phase of the business. The brothers were at their peak. The company was at its peak. The plant was full, the signal was strong, and the Crosley name meant something to nearly everyone who heard it. In June of 1945, with the war in Europe over and the Pacific War grinding toward its end, the Aviation Corporation, Avco, announced that it had acquired a controlling interest in the Crosley Corporation. The purchase price was $22 million for roughly 64% of the company's shares at $39 per share. It was a massive transaction, the kind of deal that signaled confidence in Crosley's post-war future. Avco's public statement at the time of acquisition said that no change was planned in management policies or operating personnel. The existing team would stay. The products would continue. The identity would hold. No change was planned. That was the summit, the very highest point. The moment when everything the Crosleys had built, the radios, the Shelvador, the station, the ballpark, the war work, the 10,000 paychecks, was still intact, still functioning, still stamped with the name of 2 brothers from Cincinnati who turned a child's birthday wish into an industrial empire. And it was the last moment when any of it was truly theirs. To understand what Avco wanted with Crosley, you have to understand what Avco was and what it wasn't. The Aviation Corporation had been built during the 1930s as a holding company for aviation interests. Airlines, aircraft manufacturing, engine production. Its chairman, Victor Emanuel, was a financier, not an industrialist. He didn't build things. He assembled portfolios, and by 1945, with the war ending and military contracts about to evaporate, Emanuel and his president, Irving B. Babcock, had a problem that every defense-heavy company shared. Peacetime was coming, and the revenue that had sustained them for 5 years was about to vanish. Crosley looked like the answer. Time magazine, covering the deal, framed it as Avco's attempt to put one foot on the ground, to diversify out of aviation and into the consumer markets that were about to explode as 15 million servicemen came home, married, bought houses, and filled those houses with appliances. The logic was clean on paper. Avco had capital. Crosley had products, brand recognition, a national broadcasting platform, and a manufacturing base that had just proved it could operate at enormous scale. $22 million for controlling interest seemed like a reasonable bet on the post-war consumer boom. And Powell Crosley. What did he want? The accessible record doesn't give us a clean, unambiguous answer, but the shape of it is legible. Powell was 59 years old. He'd spent 3 decades building, inventing, pivoting, selling, the kind of sustained creative exertion that wears out even the most restless minds. The war years had turned his factory into a government contractor, his workforce into a security-cleared operation, his daily life into something organized around specifications and military liaisons, rather than the freewheeling product development he loved. Family accounts suggest a man who was tired, not broken, not defeated, tired in the way that founders get tired when the thing they built has grown past the point where one person's instinct can steer it. So he sold. Not everything. Powell kept interests outside the core Crosley business, including his automobile venture, which Avco specifically excluded from the deal. But the heart of it, The radios, the refrigerators, the ranges, WLW, the Arlington Street plant, the name itself as a consumer brand, all of it passed to Avco's control. The terms were specific. Roughly 64% of Crosley's outstanding shares purchased at $39 per share for a total of approximately $22 million. Irving Babcock became involved in overseeing the transition. James D. Schaus, who had been running WLW's broadcasting operations with considerable skill, remained in place. The organizational chart looked almost the same the day after the sale as it had the day before. That was the promise. Continuity. The same people, the same products, the same name, the same identity, just a different signature on the ownership documents. The workers at the Arlington Street plant would have had no reason to panic, and most of them probably didn't. Ownership changes happened. What mattered was whether the line kept running, whether the paychecks kept clearing, whether the shift whistle still blew at the same time every morning. But something fundamental had shifted, even if no one on the factory floor could see it yet. For 25 years, the Crosley Corporation had been governed by a founder's instinct, Powell's restless, sometimes reckless conviction that the next product, the next market, the next price point was just around the corner. Lewis had disciplined that instinct into operational reality. Together, they'd built a company that moved fast, took risks, and stayed close to the consumer because the man at the top was, in his bones, a consumer products thinker. He understood kitchens. He understood living rooms. He understood what a family in Camp Washington or rural Kentucky wanted from a radio or a refrigerator because he'd spent his life imagining himself into their houses. Victor Emmanuel did not think about kitchens. Irving Babcock did not lie awake wondering how to make a washing machine cheaper. Avco was an aviation holding company that had purchased a consumer goods empire as a strategic hedge, and the difference between a founder who loves his products and a conglomerate that loves its portfolio is the difference between a house and an investment property. Both can be maintained, but only one is someone's home. The first few years after the sale looked, from the outside, like the continuity Avco had promised. The Crosley brand kept producing. The Arlington Street plant kept running. WLW kept broadcasting. The post-war consumer boom arrived exactly as predicted, and American families, newly suburban, newly prosperous, hungry for the appliances and electronics that wartime rationing had denied them, were buying everything. Refrigerators, ranges, washing machines, radios, and now the newest and most dazzling product of all, television. Crosley pushed into television early. The brand had the manufacturing base, the broadcasting expertise, and the name recognition to make a credible play. Crosley television sets appeared in showrooms alongside the radios and appliances. WLW transitioned into television broadcasting. James D. Schaus, still running the media side, understood the medium's potential and worked to position Crosley as a player in the new landscape. For a brief window in the late 1940s, the Crosley brand looked like it might ride television the way it had ridden radio. Another new technology democratized through volume production and aggressive pricing. But the competitive environment had changed in ways that Avco's portfolio logic couldn't easily absorb. Radio manufacturing in the 1920s had been a frontier, a new industry with few established players, where a bold entrant with low prices could seize enormous market share before the giants organized. Television in the late 1940s was not a frontier. It was an arms race. RCA had been preparing for television for over a decade. General Electric had manufacturing scale that dwarfed Crosley. Philco, Admiral, Zenith, the field was crowded with well-capitalized competitors who understood that television was going to require massive investment in engineering, tooling, and marketing. The little company from Cincinnati that had once outmaneuvered the industry on price was now trying to match budgets with corporations that had 10 times its resources. The Shelvador, meanwhile, was losing its edge. Through the 1930s and into the war years, the door shelf concept had been Crosley's alone, protected by patents, imitated only at legal risk. But patents expire. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the door shelf design was spreading across the refrigerator industry as competitors adopted variations of the concept. The feature that had once made Crosley refrigerators distinctly valuable was becoming standard equipment. Every manufacturer offered door shelves now. The innovation that Crosley had pioneered was no longer an innovation. It was baseline. This is the kind of erosion that happens slowly enough to miss if you're not paying attention. No single quarter felt catastrophic. No single product launch failed spectacularly. The Crosley brand was still selling, still manufacturing, still present in showrooms across the country. In 1954, the Museum of Broadcast Communications records that Crosley was the fifth largest manufacturer of radio and television sets in the United States. Fifth largest. That's not a dying company. That's a company with real market presence, real revenue, real employees building real products. But fifth largest in 1954 was not what first largest in 1925 had been. The trajectory mattered more than the snapshot. Crosley was still big enough to count, but the direction was wrong. Slowly, steadily wrong, in the way that conglomerate-owned brands often decline. Not through spectacular mismanagement, but through the gradual withdrawal of the attention and investment that a founder would have given instinctively. Avco had other divisions to worry about. Aviation was still the core business. Crosley's appliance line was one asset in a diversified portfolio. And when a portfolio asset underperforms, the logic of portfolio management is not to pour in more resources. It's to evaluate, to rationalize, eventually to divest. Nobody at the Arlington Street plant talked about it in those terms. The shift whistle still blew. The line still ran. But the company that Powell Crosley had built by instinct, by walking the floor, by arguing about price points, by imagining what a customer in Kentucky would think when she opened the refrigerator door, was now managed by men whose primary expertise was in allocating capital across unrelated business units. The founders' fingerprints were fading from every surface of the operation, and Cincinnati itself, in the early 1950s, was doing fine. The city was growing. The suburbs were expanding. New highways were carrying new cars past new shopping centers. America was booming. The irony of the Crosley story is that the city prospered while its most famous consumer brand slowly lost altitude. The decline wasn't happening because Cincinnati was struggling. It was happening because the organism that had connected Crosley to Cincinnati, the founder, the instinct, the direct link between the man who made the decisions and the neighborhood where the products were built, had been severed, and the replacement organism operated by different rules. Powell Crosley Jr. was still alive. He'd stepped back from daily management but remained a presence in Cincinnati, tending to his other interests, the automobile venture, his estates, the quiet pursuits of a wealthy man in his 60s and 70s. Whether he watched the brand's slow fade with anguish or resignation or some mixture of both, the record doesn't clearly say. What it does say is that by the mid-1950s, the company he'd built was running out of room. The television market was consolidating. The appliance market was thickening with competition. The brand's distinctive edge, cheap, innovative, cheerfully populist, had been dulled by a decade of corporate ownership that valued continuity over invention. The numbers were about to catch up with the name. Here's the sequence as the available record presents it, and it moves quickly. Avco had been assembling appliance interests beyond Crosley. The conglomerate had acquired a stake in Bendix, another major appliance and industrial brand, and was managing both names as part of a broader consumer products strategy. The strategy made sense in the boardroom: consolidate brands, eliminate redundancies, focus capital on the strongest positions, exit the weakest ones. This is what conglomerates do. This is what they are designed to do. In 1956, Avco sold its Bendix appliance division to Philco, and in the same period, the Crosley household appliance line, the refrigerators, the ranges, the washers, the brand identity that had been synonymous with affordable American kitchens for a quarter century, was discontinued. Discontinued. Not sold to another company that might have fought to keep it alive. Not spun off to management that might have tried to rebuild it. Discontinued. The line was losing money, and Avco's response was the rational corporate response. Stop losing money. Close the line. Redirect the capital. Move on. Think about what disappeared in that decision. Not just a product line, not just a brand name on a refrigerator, an entire consumer identity. The idea that a company in Cincinnati could make the best affordable appliances in the country, could put shelves in the door and nightlights in the ballpark and a signal strong enough to reach Tennessee, all from the same building in the same neighborhood with the same name on the tower. That identity had taken Powell and Lewis Crosley 25 years to build. It took Avco roughly a decade to conclude it wasn't worth keeping. The workers who built Shelvadors and assembled radio chassis and tested television tubes, what happened to them? The accessible record is thinner here than it should be. The named shop floor voices, the individual layoff stories, the specific dates when specific lines went silent, these are the details that local archives hold, but the open web largely doesn't. What we know is the shape. A workforce that had once numbered in the thousands, that had peaked at 10,000 during the war, was being reduced in stages as product lines contracted. Each reduction was someone's last day. Each reduction was a family in Camp Washington or Price Hill or Westwood recalculating what was possible. The broadcasting side survived longer. WLW was valuable, too valuable to discard, even for a conglomerate that had lost interest in making refrigerators. James D. Schaus had built the station into a broadcasting institution that transcended the appliance business, and Avco recognized that the signal was worth more than the assembly line. The station continued under Avco's ownership, eventually passing through other corporate hands in later decades. The voice survived, the products didn't, and the name itself, Crosley, entered a strange afterlife. It wasn't dead, exactly. It was orphaned. The products it had stood for were gone. The factory that had made them was winding down. The man who had given it meaning was aging quietly in Cincinnati, watching from a distance as the empire he'd built was disassembled by men who had never understood what held it together. In 1954, Crosley had still been the fifth largest radio and television manufacturer in the country. In 1956, the consumer line was gone. 2 years. That's the distance between relevance and erasure. Not a generation, not a slow fade, but a corporate decision, executed with the brisk efficiency of a portfolio adjustment. The tragedy is not that Avco was wrong to discontinue a money-losing line. By the numbers, the decision may have been defensible. The tragedy is that the line was losing money in the first place, that a brand built on populist innovation had been managed into unprofitability by owners who understood balance sheets but not kitchens. The founder's instinct had been replaced by conglomerate logic, and conglomerate logic had concluded that the founder's life work was expendable. That conclusion was reasonable. It was also the end of everything. The Arlington Street building didn't close the day the appliance line was discontinued. Buildings are slower than brands. The physical plant continued to serve various functions: reduce manufacturing, storage. Whatever uses a 330,000 square foot industrial building can be put to when its original purpose has been gutted. But the trajectory was clear, and in 1960 the facility closed. The closure didn't happen with the drama of a steel mill's last heat or an auto plant's last car rolling off the line. It happened the way most industrial endings happen in America. Gradually, then completely. Fewer workers each year. Fewer trucks at the loading docks. Fewer lights on at night. And then one day, the last person locked the last door, and the building that had made radios and refrigerators and proximity fuses and broadcast the most powerful signal in American radio was just a building. Empty. Quiet. A structure designed around work, occupied by nothing. Camp Washington felt it. Not as a single blow. The neighborhood had been absorbing the impact in stages for years, but as a cumulative weight. The plant had been the reason many families lived where they lived. You could walk to work there. You could raise kids on those paychecks. The grocers and the barbers and the landlords and the little restaurants that served lunch to factory workers, they'd all been downstream of the Crosley payroll, and when the payroll dried up, the downstream dried up with it. Bob Story, who grew up in the neighborhood and carried its memory forward, could describe what Camp Washington had been like when the plant was running and what it felt like after. The absence wasn't just economic, it was atmospheric. A neighborhood built around an active factory has a rhythm. The shift changes, the traffic, the noise, the sense that the place exists because something important is happening inside that building. Take the building out of service and the rhythm breaks. The streets don't change, the houses don't move. But the organizing principle, the thing that explained why all of it was there, disappears. The building itself began its long passage into ruin. It was too large to repurpose easily, too industrial to convert cheaply, and too solid to demolish without enormous expense. So it sat, through the 1960s, through the 1970s, through the decades when Cincinnati, like every Midwestern city, was reshaping itself around highways and suburbs and a service economy that had no particular use for a 330,000 square foot factory in a working class neighborhood by the freight tracks. The White Tower still rose above the roofline. You could see it from the interstate. You could see it from the hillsides. It was the most visible thing in Camp Washington, and for a while the only thing most outsiders knew about the neighborhood. That ruin on Arlington Street, the one with the tower, the one people sometimes came to photograph with a kind of reverence, as though the building were a monument to something they couldn't quite name. By the 2000s, the building had been vacant for decades. The windows were broken or boarded. The interior floors were deteriorating. Asbestos, lead paint, environmental contamination. The full catalog of industrial-era liabilities had accumulated inside those walls. In 2009, the building was described as entirely abandoned. In 2012, it was condemned. A structure that had once employed 10,000 people and broadcast to half the continent was now officially too dangerous to enter. The Port of Greater Cincinnati, the Regional Development Authority, eventually took control of the property. Environmental assessments were conducted. Brownfield remediation was discussed. Redevelopment proposals circulated. Ambitious plans to convert the building into mixed-use space, to preserve the shell while filling it with new purpose. Joe Gorman and other redevelopment figures worked to push the project forward, to argue that the building's bones were worth saving even if the building's original life was gone. The plans moved slowly. Asbestos abatement alone was a multi-million-dollar undertaking. The structure needed seismic and structural assessment. Financing was uncertain. The gap between what the building was and what it could become was enormous, not just financially, but imaginatively. How do you convert a place that made radios and refrigerators and broadcast a signal heard in 20 states into something that makes sense in a 21st century urban economy? The question had no easy answer, and the building waited while Cincinnati tried to find one. Camp Washington, meanwhile, kept going. The neighborhood didn't vanish when Crosley left. People stayed, new businesses opened. The community adapted in the way that American industrial neighborhoods have always adapted. Imperfectly, unevenly, with stubbornness and creativity and loss. But the Crosley building remained the neighborhood's most visible landmark, and its emptiness remained the neighborhood's most visible wound. Powell Crosley Jr. died in 1961, 1 year after the Arlington Street facility closed. He was 74. He'd outlived his empire by just long enough to see the building go dark. Lewis had died in 1958, before the final closure. Spared, if that's the word, the site of the plant they'd built together standing empty for the first time in 3 decades. What the Crosleys left behind is not easy to catalog because the most important parts of it are invisible. Open your refrigerator. Look at the door. Those shelves, the ones holding the ketchup, the mustard, the orange juice, the eggs in their molded tray, are Crosley's idea. Every refrigerator in every kitchen in America carries that design, and almost nobody knows where it came from. The Shelvador patent expired decades ago. The concept outlived the company, outlived the brand, outlived the building where it was first manufactured. It became so universal that its origin story disappeared. Turn on the radio. The idea that a household should have affordable access to broadcast entertainment, that radio should be cheap enough for a family in a small town or on a farm to own, not a luxury reserved for the urban middle class, was Crosley's argument, made in products and prices rather than words. He didn't invent radio. He democratized it. He made it ordinary, which is to say he made it American, because the American genius has always been less about invention than about scale, taking a technology that exists and making it available to everyone. WLW still broadcasts. The call letters are still active. The signal still goes out from Cincinnati, though the station has passed through many corporate hands since Avco and bears almost no visible connection to the man who built it into the most powerful radio station in the country. The voice survives. The name behind it has been forgotten. The Arlington Street building still stands. It stands the way ruins stand in cities, too big to ignore, too complicated to fix, too embedded in the neighborhood to disappear. The White Tower still rises above the roofline of Camp Washington. The freight tracks still run alongside. The streets that Crosley's workers walk to get to the morning shift are still there, though the houses have changed and the walk leads nowhere productive now. People still come to photograph the building. They come with cameras and a kind of quiet respect, the way people visit a grave. What they're photographing is not decay. It's evidence, the physical proof that something enormous once happened here. Something that connected a neighborhood to a nation, that turned a building into a broadcast tower and a factory into a cultural engine, and a child's birthday wish into an empire that employed 10,000 people, and changed how America kept its food cold, and heard its music and watched its baseball. The Crosley story is not a story about a company that was destroyed by competition, or wrecked by scandal, or killed by a single catastrophic mistake. It's a story about what happens when the person who built something is replaced by people who acquired it. Powell Crosley understood kitchens and living rooms, and the precise amount of money a working family would spend on a product that made daily life slightly better. Victor Emmanuel understood portfolios and diversification and the strategic logic of putting one foot on the ground. Both of them were operating rationally within their own frames of reference. The problem was that only one of those frames of reference could feel what a Shelvador meant to a woman in Kentucky, opening her refrigerator door and finding room for everything. The decisions that ended the Crosley consumer empire were not irrational. They were not corrupt. They were not made by men who set out to destroy something. They were made by men who set out to manage something. And management, applied to a living enterprise that ran on instinct and invention, turned out to be a form of slow suffocation. Each decision was defensible. Each step was logical. And each one moved the story a little closer to the silence that fills the Arlington Street building now. The building waits. It has been waiting for more than 60 years. It waited through the decades when Camp Washington contracted around its absence. It waited through condemnation and environmental assessment and redevelopment proposals that came and went like weather. It waits now, enormous and patient and visibly scarred, for someone to decide whether what happened inside those walls matters enough to preserve the shell that held it. The tower is still the tallest thing in the neighborhood. On certain evenings, when the light comes in low from the west and catches the white concrete, you can almost see what it looked like when the windows were whole and the lights were on and the signal went out from the top floors into the dark, reaching across Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and beyond, carrying voices and music and baseball and the sound of a country listening to itself. The signal is gone. The building remains. And inside it, in the silence where the work used to be, something that was once the future stands perfectly still, waiting for whatever comes next.